The Duke had abandoned his wife for another woman, but nothing prepared him for the sight of his Duchess dying alone on a cold stone floor. A violent storm shook Blackwood Palace as Duke Edward raced through the neglected eastern wing, his footsteps echoing. Lydia had sworn that Eleanor had left the estate. She had looked him in the eyes and told him his wife was gone. But a faint sound behind a locked chamber door had proved otherwise. Edward struck the door until the frame splintered beneath his shoulder. What waited inside stopped him cold. Eleanor lay beside the bed, her pale face turned toward the rain-streaked window. One hand rested near an empty medicine bottle. The other reached toward a half-finished letter scattered across the floor. Her breathing was thin, her fingers colder than the stone beneath her. Edward dropped beside her and gathered her into his arms. Only then did he see the severed bell rope hanging uselessly against the wall. She had called for help. Someone had made certain no one would answer. Eleanor's eyes opened for a moment. There was no anger left in them, only the quiet ruin of a woman who had begged to be believed until she no longer had the strength to beg. She managed to tell him that she had tried to warn him, but he had chosen Lydia. Edward shouted for the physician, promising that help was coming. Yet Eleanor used what little breath remained to direct him toward the ledger beneath the palace chapel and warn him never to surrender the eastern port. Then came the words that turned his fear into horror. The blue seal was false. Lydia had lied about everything. Eleanor's body went still in his arms, and as Edward's desperate cries echoed through the abandoned wing, the truth began 8 weeks earlier, with the day he invited his former lover into his home. 8 weeks earlier, Blackwood Palace had welcomed Duke Edward home as a hero. The road leading to the estate was crowded with tenants, widows, veterans, and children waving the Blackwood colors. Edward had expected to return to empty storehouses, unpaid soldiers, and frightened villagers struggling beneath the weight of war. Instead, he found repaired cottages, full granaries, settled accounts, and an estate that had remained prosperous despite his long absence. Eleanor had done it all. She had sold her personal jewels to support the families of fallen soldiers. She had negotiated with merchants when the harvest failed, reduced rents during the harshest winter, and stopped dishonest creditors from seizing the tenants' land. Everywhere Edward went, people praised the Duchess who had protected them while their Duke was away. He should have been proud of her. Instead, every word of admiration deepened the quiet wound inside him. The estate had survived without his leadership. His people looked to Eleanor for decisions. Even the council members spoke to her with the confidence once reserved for him. Edward began to wonder whether he had returned as Duke or merely as the husband of a woman who no longer needed him. Eleanor sensed the distance growing between them. She prepared private dinners, reopened their old rooms, and tried to remind him that everything she had protected still belonged to them both. But Edward no longer saw devotion in her strength. He saw control. Then Lady Lydia Vale arrived at the palace gates, dressed in mourning. She claimed her husband had died during the war, and that his family had taken everything from her. With nowhere else to go, she had come to the man who had once promised he would always protect her. Long before Edward married Eleanor, Lydia had been his first love. She entered the palace with lowered eyes and careful gratitude. She praised Eleanor's leadership, admired her generosity, and spoke so softly that no one could accuse her of disrespect. Yet whenever she found Edward alone, her grief gave way to something far more calculated. She reminded him that everyone celebrated what Eleanor had achieved, while barely remembering what he had sacrificed. She made him feel admired, rather than unnecessary, powerful, rather than replaced. The first humiliation came during a private dinner. Edward placed Lydia beside him in the chair traditionally reserved for the Duchess. When Eleanor quietly questioned the arrangement, he dismissed her concern as jealousy. Lydia immediately offered to move, but her performance was perfect. She knew Edward would insist that she remain. Days later, he gave Lydia the luxurious Western apartments and instructed Eleanor to ensure that their guest lacked nothing. Then, the estate steward, Mr. Harrow, presented Edward with accounts suggesting that Eleanor had concealed serious debts during the war. Edward did not ask his wife to explain them. He simply removed her from the next council meeting. When Eleanor confronted him, he told her that she might still carry the title of Duchess, but Lydia was the only woman who made him feel like a man. In that moment, Eleanor understood the truth. Lydia had not entered Blackwood Palace seeking refuge. She had entered it to take possession of Eleanor's marriage. The Founders' Ball should have been Eleanor's night. For generations, the reigning Duchess of Blackwood had opened the celebration from the carved ceremonial chair beside the Duke. Yet when Eleanor entered the great hall, the musicians faltered, and a hush spread through the assembled nobles. Lydia was already sitting in her place. Around her throat gleamed the Blackwood emeralds, a necklace worn only by the woman who held the Duchess's title. Eleanor stopped beneath the chandeliers, but she gave no one the satisfaction of seeing her break. Edward dismissed the insult with a careless explanation. Lydia had needed something suitable for the occasion, and the jewels had merely been lent to her. Before Eleanor could answer, Lydia rose and announced that funds intended for wounded soldiers and their families had disappeared from the estate accounts. Mr. Harrow stepped forward, carrying several letters marked with Eleanor's signature. According to the documents, she had secretly transferred the money into an account linked to her mother's family. The accusation moved through the hall like fire. Eleanor needed only one glance to know the letters were false. She asked Edward to suspend judgment until the records could be examined, but Lydia accused her of hiding behind her rank. Edward chose humiliation over caution. Before nobles, officers, and servants, he ordered Eleanor to surrender the household keys and make a public apology. He expected her to kneel. She did not. With her heart breaking beneath a face of perfect calm, Eleanor told him that he could give Lydia her chair, her jewels, and even his heart, but he would never force her to confess to a lie. Edward's expression hardened. He handed temporary control of the household accounts to Lydia. The wound was deeper than anything Eleanor had endured since his return, yet she neither begged nor wept before the court. Instead, she studied the documents again. Each letter was sealed with blue wax. Eleanor's private office used burgundy. Blue wax belonged only to the steward's records room. One letter was also dated on a day she had appeared before the Royal Tax Commission in the capital, surrounded by witnesses. Whoever forged her name had not checked where she had been. That night, Eleanor entered the records room with her maid, Anna. They found Thomas Reed, a junior clerk, bent over a desk, carefully copying Eleanor's signature onto blank financial orders. Terrified, Thomas admitted that Harrow had threatened his family. He had been ordered to create evidence against the Duchess. Then he revealed that the missing money was only the beginning. Lydia and Harrow were preparing documents to have Eleanor declared mentally unfit. Before Thomas could name the final person involved, footsteps sounded beyond the door. Someone was coming. The footsteps stopped outside the records room. Eleanor extinguished the lamp, while Anna pulled Thomas behind a row of account shelves. For several breathless moments, the handle turned against the lock. Then, Mr. Harrow's voice sounded from the corridor, warning a servant that no one was permitted inside without his approval. Only after he left did Eleanor understand how little time remained. She refused to confront Edward with nothing more than a frightened clerk's confession. Lydia had already taught him to interpret every defense as jealousy and every accusation as madness. If Eleanor spoke too soon, the evidence would disappear before anyone beyond Blackwood Palace could examine it. So she investigated quietly. Thomas copied records showing that relief money had been diverted from wounded soldiers into an account controlled by Lydia and Harrow. Anna identified servants who had received unusual payments. Eleanor uncovered forged household orders, altered financial reports, and a medical statement describing her as unstable, although the physician named on it had never examined her. The conspiracy extended far beyond stolen money. Eleanor had lived for years with a manageable weakness of the heart. Her longtime physician had prescribed a strengthening medicine that allowed her to live normally. But the palace records showed that Lydia had personally authorized a new physician and ordered Eleanor's treatment replaced with a weaker substitute. The change had not been made to heal her. Someone was preparing to turn an ordinary illness into a fatal one. Eleanor placed her remaining supply of the true medicine in Anna's care. Then she examined the original agreement signed before her marriage to Edward. A new page had been inserted. It declared that if Eleanor died without appointing another trustee, or if she were judged mentally incompetent, control of the Eastern Port would pass directly to the Duke. The false page carried the same blue seal used on the forged letters. Now the entire plan became clear. Lydia did not merely want Eleanor's husband. She wanted the port Eleanor had inherited from her mother, its wealth, and the power it carried. Eleanor copied every document. She concealed the originals beneath an old ledger in the palace chapel and entrusted another set to Thomas, instructing him to deliver them to the royal chancellor. And at that moment, one question stood before her. If you were Eleanor, would you confront the Duke immediately or remain silent until you possessed enough evidence to destroy Lydia's entire plan? Eleanor chose silence, but Lydia soon discovered that someone had entered the records room. She told Edward that his wife had become irrational, wandering through restricted rooms and accusing innocent servants of treason. When Eleanor tried to explain the forged documents and the blue seal, Lydia dissolved into frightened tears and claimed the Duchess had threatened her life. Edward believed her without examining a single page. The following evening, Thomas failed to return from his journey. His room had been emptied. His papers were gone. No one admitted seeing him leave the estate. When Eleanor entered her chamber, she found a message waiting on her pillow. It contained only one warning. She must stop searching, or the Duke would bury her before he ever learned the truth. The warning on Eleanor's pillow was only the beginning. By morning, Lydia had convinced Edward that his wife was preparing to flee Blackwood with the stolen relief money. The accusation gave him all the justification he needed to strip Eleanor of the little power she still possessed. Anna was dismissed without the chance to defend herself. Eleanor's personal accounts were frozen. Her letters were seized before leaving the palace, and her place on the estate council was given to Lydia. Her chambers were searched, her household keys were taken, and the servants were ordered to accept instructions from the Duke's mistress instead of their Duchess. Then Eleanor was moved to the neglected eastern wing. Lydia described the decision publicly as an act of compassion. According to her, Eleanor needed peace, privacy, and protection from the strain that had disturbed her mind. But the eastern wing had not been properly occupied in years. Its corridors were cold, its windows rattled in the wind, and only a handful of servants were permitted to enter. Before Anna was forced through the palace gates, Eleanor pressed copies of the forged letters into her hands. She instructed her to reach the royal chancellor and reveal everything, even if Eleanor did not survive long enough to testify. A second collection of evidence remained hidden beneath the old chapel ledger. Eleanor also wrote 3 private letters to Edward. In each one, she explained the missing money, the false medical report, the altered marriage agreement, and the significance of the blue seal. She begged him only to meet her without Lydia present. None of the letters reached him. Lydia kept every one. Edward finally came to the eastern wing after announcing that he intended to petition the crown for an annulment. Eleanor had grown pale, but she faced him with the last of her strength. She asked him to compare the dates on the forged documents, question her former physician, and examine the blue wax used to seal the letters. Edward refused. By then, Lydia had taught him to see every fact Eleanor presented as another attempt to manipulate him. He told her that he had once loved the woman he believed she was, but Lydia had revealed what was hidden beneath the title. Eleanor looked at the husband she had protected, waited for, and trusted. Then she told him Lydia had revealed nothing. She had only shown him the lie he already wanted to believe. Edward left without looking back. That was the moment Eleanor stopped fighting to save their marriage. From then on, she fought only to save herself and the people whose future depended upon her port. That evening, the medicine delivered to her chamber tasted unusually sweet. Eleanor immediately knew it was not the treatment prescribed by her physician, but when she searched for the true bottle she had kept hidden, it was gone. Her breathing became shallow. Her hands trembled so badly that she could scarcely hold a pen. She tried to reach the chapel, but guards blocked the corridor. They had been told that the Duchess was confused and must not be allowed to wander. Realizing she might never leave the room alive, Eleanor began one final letter. She recorded Lydia's scheme, Harrow's involvement, and the location of the hidden evidence. Before she could finish, pain tightened around her chest. She pulled the bell cord again and again. No one came. When she followed the rope upward, she discovered it had been cut beyond the wall. The chamber door had also been locked from the outside. Eleanor tried to reach the window, but her strength failed halfway across the room. As she collapsed onto the freezing stone, laughter drifted faintly through the distant corridor. Lydia was with Edward. Eleanor reached toward the unfinished letter beside her bed, but before her fingers could touch it, the room disappeared into darkness. Lydia believed Eleanor would not survive the night. With the Duchess locked away and too weak to defend herself, she brought the Eastern Port transfer documents to Edward's study and urged him to sign them immediately. She claimed Eleanor's family might interfere once news of her condition reached them, and warned that the harbor could be lost unless he acted before dawn. But something in her urgency unsettled him. For weeks, Lydia had insisted that Eleanor was a dishonest woman driven by jealousy and greed. Yet now, while his wife lay dangerously ill, Lydia spoke only of ships, revenue, and ownership. Then, confidence made her careless. She told Edward that once the Duchess was gone, the harbour would finally belong to them. Edward's hand froze above the document. He asked what she meant by gone. For the first time, Lydia's calm expression faltered. She quickly claimed she meant gone from Blackwood after the annulment, but the answer came too late. Suspicion had already entered the place where trust had once blinded him. Before he could question her further, a commotion broke out beyond the study. Anna had returned to the palace. She had slipped through an old servant's entrance and forced her way past the guards, refusing to leave until she spoke to the Duke. Breathless and mud-stained from the road, she told Edward that Eleanor's medicine had been replaced, her letters had been intercepted, and Thomas had uncovered forged documents linking Lydia and Mr. Harrow to the missing relief funds. She told him the Eastern Wing was not a place of rest. It was a prison. Edward accused her of repeating Eleanor's lies, but Anna placed a copied financial order on his desk. It bore Eleanor's signature and the unmistakable blue seal belonging to Harrow's records office. The colour struck Edward like a warning he had refused to hear. He went directly to Lydia's apartments. Inside a locked cabinet, he found all 3 letters Eleanor had written to him. None had been opened. Beneath them were records of payments to Harrow, instructions removing Eleanor's longtime physician, and an order commanding the servants not to answer the Duchess's bell. He found draft documents transferring the Eastern port and, hidden behind them, Eleanor's missing bottle of medicine. The truth stood before him in his own hands. Lydia had used his wounded pride, but she had not forced him to distrust his wife. Again and again, Eleanor had asked him to examine the evidence. Again and again, he had refused because believing Lydia was easier than admitting how cruelly he had judged the woman who loved him. Edward ran. He raced through the neglected corridors of the Eastern Wing until he reached Eleanor's chamber. The door was locked. He struck it with his shoulder until the frame broke apart. Eleanor lay beside the bed, exactly where she had fallen. The empty bottle rested near her hand. Her unfinished letter was scattered across the floor, and the severed bell rope hung uselessly against the wall. Edward dropped beside her and lifted her into his arms. With what little strength remained, Eleanor warned him about the ledger hidden beneath the palace chapel and the false blue seal. Edward tried to apologize, but she told him he had possessed weeks in which to believe her. She had only seconds left to hear him. Her chest rose once. Then her body became still. The royal physician rushed into the chamber, but could find no steady pulse. He ordered Edward outside and continued fighting desperately to restore her breathing. Edward rose from the floor, with Eleanor's bloodless hand slipping from his own. Believing his wife had died before he could earn even the right to ask forgiveness, he turned toward the waiting guards. He ordered every gate of Blackwood Palace sealed. No carriage would leave, no servant would disappear, and Lady Lydia Vale would not take another step beyond those walls. Before dawn, the great council chamber of Blackwood Palace was filled with every person Lydia had hoped would never hear the truth. The royal chancellor sat beneath the crown's seal, surrounded by senior nobles, estate officers, physicians, and servants summoned as witnesses. Guards stood at every entrance. No one was permitted to leave until Eleanor's final hours had been explained. Lydia arrived, dressed in black, her face carefully arranged into grief. She claimed Eleanor had rejected treatment, locked herself away, and perhaps even harmed herself to punish the husband she believed had abandoned her. Edward allowed her to finish, Then he placed Eleanor's real medicine on the council table and revealed that it had been discovered inside Lydia's locked cabinet. For the first time, whispers turned against her. Lydia insisted the bottle had been planted. She accused Anna of conspiring with Eleanor and claimed the Duchess had arranged the entire scene to destroy her reputation. But Eleanor had prepared for that lie long before she became too weak to speak. Anna led the royal chancellor into the palace chapel. Beneath the old ledger, they found everything Eleanor had hidden: the original estate accounts, the false page inserted into her marriage agreement, copies of transfers made to Lydia and Harrow, instructions carrying the steward's blue seal, and a list of servants who had accepted bribes. There was also a written account in Eleanor's own hand, recording every attempt to discredit, isolate, and deprive her of the medicine keeping her alive. The truth did not depend upon Edward's regret. It rested upon Eleanor's courage, foresight, and refusal to surrender when no one believed her. When the evidence was placed before the council, Lydia immediately turned on Mr. Harrow. She claimed the steward had acted alone and had used her name without permission. Harrow refused to carry the blame quietly. Terrified by the charges against him, he accused Lydia of drawing him into the conspiracy with promises of wealth and influence. He admitted that the relief funds had been diverted, the letters forged, and the marriage agreement altered. But he insisted that Lydia had designed the plan because only she knew how deeply Edward resented living in Eleanor's shadow. As they struggled to save themselves, each revealed what the other had tried to conceal. The royal chancellor compared the forged orders with genuine documents signed by Eleanor. The differences were unmistakable. Her former physician then testified that her heart condition was manageable with the proper medicine, but without it, her strength could fail with frightening speed. Lydia still refused to confess. She claimed there was no proof she had ordered the forgeries. Then the doors opened. Thomas Reed entered the chamber, supported by 2 tenants from the Blackwood estate. His face was bruised, and one arm was bound against his chest. He explained that Harrow's men had attacked him on the road and left him unconscious, believing the evidence had been destroyed. But a tenant family loyal to Eleanor had found him and protected both him and the document hidden beneath his coat. Thomas placed Lydia's written order before the Chancellor. It instructed him to copy Eleanor's signature onto financial transfers and promised him payment after the Duchess had been declared mentally incompetent. Lydia's final defense collapsed. The Chancellor then turned to Edward and asked the question no one else dared to speak. Why had the Duke of Blackwood ignored his wife's warnings? Edward could have blamed Lydia's manipulation. He could have hidden behind forged documents and carefully manufactured lies. Instead, he admitted the truth. His jealousy had poisoned his judgment. He had humiliated Eleanor before the court, removed her authority without proof, allowed Lydia to imprison her, and dismissed every warning because Lydia made him feel admired and powerful. Lydia had deceived him, but he had chosen not to investigate. His choices had nearly killed his wife. The royal chancellor ruled that Edward would temporarily lose independent control of the estate. Until Eleanor recovered and decided otherwise, the Crown would supervise Blackwood's household finances and protect the Eastern Port from transfer. Mr. Harrow was arrested for theft, forgery, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Every servant who had accepted Lydia's money was dismissed and taken for questioning. Lydia was stripped of Edward's protection and charged with fraud, unlawful imprisonment, theft, and deliberately withholding life-saving medicine. As the guards led her away, She turned to Edward and told him that even if Eleanor lived, she would never forgive him. Edward did not defend himself. He answered only that forgiveness was no longer his to demand. Moments later, the royal physician entered the chamber. Eleanor's heart had stopped, but only briefly. The treatment had restored a faint pulse. She was alive, although no one could yet promise that she would awaken. For several days, Blackwood Palace waited. When Eleanor finally opened her eyes, Anna told her that the evidence had survived. Lydia and Harrow had been arrested, and Edward had confessed before the council. Eleanor did not ask for her husband. Her first question was whether the stolen money had been returned to the soldiers' families. Her second was whether her port remained protected. Only after Anna confirmed, both did Eleanor agree to receive the Duke. Edward entered her chamber, carrying 2 documents. The first was a complete confession bearing his signature. The second was an annulment he had already signed, giving Eleanor the freedom to end their marriage without surrendering her title, fortune, or home. He placed both papers before her and waited. Justice had been delivered. Now Eleanor had to decide whether the marriage that nearly cost her life deserved to survive. Edward did not kneel to ask for mercy. He knelt because, for the first time, he understood that his title gave him no claim over the woman he had nearly allowed to die. He admitted that Lydia had found the weakest part of him and fed it with praise. But she had not forced him to shame Eleanor, ignore the forged dates, dismiss the blue seal, or leave his wife imprisoned in the eastern wing. Those choices had been his. Then he placed the signed annulment in Eleanor's hands, along with documents restoring control of her port, inheritance, household, and fortune. She could leave Blackwood without losing her title, property, or crown protection. Eleanor studied the papers. Survival, she told him, did not erase betrayal. Once strong enough to travel, she would move to her coastal estate, govern the eastern port, and establish an independent household. Edward could write, but he would not visit unless invited. She offered no promise of reconciliation. Remorse, she made clear, was only the beginning. If he wished to become a better man, he would have to prove it through action. In the months that followed, Lydia and Harrow were convicted and imprisoned. The stolen relief money was returned to the families of wounded soldiers. Anna became head of Eleanor's household, while Thomas received crown protection and a position in the Royal Accounts Office. Edward remained Duke of Blackwood, but the council restricted his financial authority. He restored the Eastern Wing and transformed it into an infirmary for women unable to afford medical care. He never presented the work as payment for forgiveness. It acknowledged the suffering he had refused to see. Several months later, Eleanor invited him to her coastal estate. She stood overlooking the harbor, stronger now, surrounded by workers and families whose futures she had protected. Edward asked whether they might one day begin again. Eleanor told him that he had found her before her final breath, but the wife who once trusted him had died in that room. Whether another woman could someday trust him would depend entirely on what he did next. She did not take his hand. But she did not ask him to leave. Lydia had nearly destroyed Eleanor's life, but Edward's failure began when he chose flattery over truth. Eleanor's greatest victory was not preserving her marriage. It was reclaiming the authority, dignity, and voice others had tried to take from her. Should Eleanor ever forgive the Duke, or did his betrayal destroy their marriage forever? Share your decision in the comments. Subscribe for more unforgettable stories of betrayal, hidden conspiracies, courageous duchesses, and the shocking consequences waiting behind palace doors,